I was the last person who should have been holding that envelope. At least, that's what everyone in the attorney's office seemed to believe. My nephew, Darren, glared at me from across the conference table as though I had stolen something out of his hands. My sister, Lorraine, kept tapping the floor with her expensive shoes, a habit she'd developed whenever she was about to make a scene. But for once, I wasn't the one on trial in this family. Grandma Eleanor's estate attorney, Mr. Rudd, slid the sealed envelope toward me with a slow, deliberate motion. His fingers lingered over it for a moment before he spoke. "Your grandmother wanted you to have this privately," she said. His voice softened, shifting into a tone I had rarely heard from him. "She said she trusted you most." The words struck the air like a stone dropped into still water. Even after all these years, hearing that someone trusted me, especially someone like her, felt like a weight pressing against my chest. Lorraine scoffed under her breath. Darren shook his head. I didn't respond to either of them. I simply took the envelope, feeling its surprising heaviness. There was more than paper inside. Something metal shifted inside it. My grandmother had died only 5 days earlier. She had been 93, sharp-minded until her last hour, and stubborn in a way only women who've survived multiple wars, recessions, and betrayals could be. She had raised me more than my own mother had. She had taught me how to fix a leaky faucet, negotiate a sale, and, more importantly, recognize the truth even when someone tried to hide it. But she never gave gifts without a purpose. And she certainly never left things unfinished. "Before you read it," Mr. Rudd continued, "there's something you all should know." He opened a thin folder, revealing a series of documents with large red stamps across them. The first said transfer pending. Another read property dispute filed. Lorraine's entire posture tightened. Darren sat up straighter, alert now. But before Mr. Rudd could explain, his assistant rushed into the room, pale-faced and breathless. "Sir, the bank just called. Someone attempted to access the Delmont account this morning." Every pair of eyes in the room snapped toward me, except mine. I looked at Lorraine. It wasn't me trying to access that account, and she knew it. But she smiled, thin and poisonous, and said, "Well, isn't the timing interesting?" My fingers tightened around the envelope. I suddenly felt very certain that whatever was inside would explain everything. Grandma's final decisions, the strange tension she carried in her last weeks, and perhaps most importantly, why she had written the words "I trust you most" instead of saying them aloud. I slid a finger under the flap. But just as I began opening it, Mr. Rudd placed a hand on mine. "Not here," he said quietly. "You'll want privacy for this." His eyes held something I hadn't seen before. Concern, maybe even fear. And in that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't simply a will. It was a warning. And possibly a confession. What I didn't know yet was that the contents of that envelope would append every assumption I had about my family, and ignite a chain of events that would lead me down a path of quiet, deliberate revenge. I tucked the envelope into my purse. Across the table, Lorraine whispered to Darren, too loudly to be accidental, "She's going to ruin everything." But neither of them understood. I hadn't ruined anything. Not yet. And when I finally read the will later that evening, alone in my dimly lit kitchen, I realized why Grandma had chosen me, and what she expected me to do next. Because the will didn't leave me something. The will exposed something. And it was about to tear my family apart. My name is Marion Pierce, and I am 65 years old. I have lived long enough to know that most betrayals do not arrive like thunder. They start quietly, little tremors, subtle shifts, an uneasy feeling in the pit of your stomach that you learn to ignore until it's too late. I've also lived long enough to understand that trust is a fragile currency. For reasons I've never fully understood, many people in my family spent years treating me like I was overdrawing on that currency, as though simply being myself was some sort of liability. Not to Grandma Eleanor. She once told me, long before her memory began to fade around the edges, "You see people clearly, Marion. That's your blessing and your curse." I suppose she was right. For a while, That clarity made my marriage difficult. My late husband, Richard, was the type of man who preferred a polite lie over an uncomfortable truth. We stayed married for 18 years, long enough for me to learn the value of silence, but not long enough for me to forget who I was. After our divorce, people said I had changed. But I hadn't. I had simply stopped apologizing. My family never adapted to that version of me, especially Lorraine. She was always the golden one, the daughter who became a successful real estate broker, married a man with a glossy smile and a taste for expensive vacations, and raised a son who could do no wrong. Meanwhile, I built a modest life. I worked in community development. I volunteered at the library. I grew tomatoes in my backyard and read poetry on Sundays. And yet, when Grandma grew older, it was me she called when she needed groceries. Me she trusted with her medical decisions. Me she confided in when she feared something was wrong with her finances. But she had never shared the full story with me. Not until that envelope. When I finally opened it that evening, I found a letter written in her careful cursive, along with an old brass key wrapped in tissue paper. The letter began, "Marion, if you are reading this, it means they have already begun circling." I froze. The rest of the letter revealed something I was not prepared for, something that reframed every distant look she'd given in her final months. But just as I reached the final lines, a sudden knock at my front door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. I folded the letter, slipped the key into my sweater pocket, and walked toward the door. Through the window I saw a silhouette, tall, tense, impatient. It was Darren. And he wasn't alone. I opened the door only halfway. Enough to see them. Not enough to let them in. Darren stood with his hands shoved into the pockets of his designer jacket, the one Lorraine insisted made him look professional. Lorraine hovered behind him, arms crossed, chin lifted as though she had just caught someone sneaking out a side door at a party she hosted. "Mom wanted to check on you," Darren said. His tone betrayed the fact that this was not his idea. Lorraine smiled. "Tight. Practiced. False. We thought you might want company tonight." I stepped into the doorway, making it clear that they were not invited inside. "I'm all right. Just tired." Lorraine tilted her head. "You opened it, didn't you?" I didn't answer. She pushed a little closer, testing the frame of the door with her manicured fingers. "Marion, this is ridiculous. The lawyer clearly made a mistake. Whatever Grandma left you, it's probably sentimental. The real business of her estate is something we all deserve to handle." I felt a familiar ache beneath her words, the implication that I was always unfit, always less capable, always on the margins. But something in me had shifted the moment I read Grandma's letter. I no longer felt the need to defend myself. "I'll contact you when I'm ready," I said. "Good night, Lorraine." Her expression hardened just enough for me to notice. Darren looked uncomfortable, his eyes darting around as if he expected someone to overhear us. "Actually," he said quietly, "there's something you should know." Lorraine shot him a warning glare. He stopped talking. They left after a few more thinly veiled comments, the type only family members could deliver with a straight face. When their car finally pulled away, I returned to my kitchen table and reopened Grandma's letter. The next paragraph revealed a truth she had never spoken aloud. She wrote about a property I didn't know she owned. A financial agreement she made years ago. A promise someone in the family had broken. And then one line, circled twice, stopped my breath. "If anything happens to me, look for where the key belongs." The brass key weighed heavily in my palm. I had no idea what it opened. But I knew exactly who didn't want me to find out. Because Grandma's letter named one person explicitly. And it wasn't Lorraine. It wasn't Darren. It was someone else entirely. Someone whose influence in the family had been quiet, almost invisible. Someone I would never have suspected. The betrayal brewing beneath our family's surface was older, deeper, and far more deliberate than I imagined. And according to the letter, I was now responsible for exposing it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter, the key, and a growing sense that the past was reaching out with cold fingers, pulling me into something I hadn't been prepared to face. It wasn't until 3 in the morning that I pieced together the meaning of the date scrawled in the margin of the letter, a date from 12 years ago. The year Grandma had quietly sold a small parcel of land on the edge of town. At least, that was the story she'd told us. But in her letter, she confessed that the land had never actually been sold. It had been transferred, temporarily, she thought, for safekeeping. She had entrusted it to someone in the family, someone she believed would protect it until she could move it back into her name. The property was a modest cabin and 2 acres of forest, nothing grand, nothing profitable. But it had belonged to her parents. She had played there as a child. She had taken me there once, long before the others were deemed old enough to understand its quiet importance. The betrayal came later, after she tried to reclaim it. She wrote, "He told me the documents were lost. Then he stopped returning my calls." My heartbeat slowed to a dreadful crawl. He. Not Lorraine. Not Darren. My older brother, Charles. Charles, who lived 2 states away. Charles, who rarely came to family gatherings but always managed to call Grandma the day before her birthday so she wouldn't notice he'd forgotten the actual date. Charles, who managed Grandma's accounts the year after Grandpa died, because he claimed to understand numbers better than the rest of us. I pressed my palms against the table, steadying myself. She had offered him a chance to correct the mistake. He never did. In her letter she didn't accuse him directly, but her disappointment bled between every line, as though she couldn't bear to name the betrayal aloud. She had hoped, even in her final year, that he would amend the transfer documents and return the property to her. When he didn't, she turned to something far more deliberate. She left the key. She left the letter. She left the truth for me. Her last paragraph shook me. "If he took what was mine, Marion, I fear he has taken more. Look for the cabin. Look inside. The truth waits." I folded the letter slowly. I understood now. The brass key wasn't symbolic. It was practical. It belonged to the cabin. The cabin Charles claimed no longer existed. He had lied to her. He had stolen something that wasn't his. And judging from the tension in that attorney's office, I suspected he wasn't done stealing. As dawn approached, pale light stretched across my kitchen like a revelation. I found myself standing, grabbing my coat, and slipping the key into my pocket. I needed to see the cabin for myself. I needed to know what Grandma had left behind. But before I could leave, my phone buzzed. A text message. From an unknown number. "Do not go to the property. We need to talk first." I didn't recognize the number, but I knew the tone. It was Charles. And he knew exactly what I was about to do. I didn't respond to the message. I simply turned off the phone, slipped it into my coat, and drove. The morning fog rolled across the rural roads like low, watchful clouds. The cabin lay 40 minutes outside town, tucked behind an old logging trail almost no one remembered anymore. As I neared the turn, the trees thinned and the past began to stir, waking fragments of childhood memories I had stored deep inside myself. The trail was narrower than I remembered, overgrown and quiet. But the key turned smoothly in the rusted padlock on the gate, as though it had been waiting, patient, loyal, for someone who still belonged here. When I stepped inside the cabin, dust shifted in the air, drifting through the beams of light spilling through cracked windows. Everything smelled faintly of cedar, age, and stillness. But it wasn't abandoned. Not entirely. On the small kitchen table sat a folder. Newer than everything else in the room. Inside. A bank statement spanning 15 years, copies of Grandma's investment accounts are notarized, but unsigned, property transfer reversal, and a document I hadn't expected at all. A durable financial power of attorney naming Charles as her representative, dated a year after she told me she ended that arrangement. My chest tightened. I knew enough about legal documents to recognize the irregularities. The signature page had been printed twice, once signed, once blank. The signed version had a faint indentation where another sheet had been pressed against it with a pen. Someone had traced her signature. Not well, but enough to pass a casual review. I took photos of everything. Then I carefully returned each document to its place. Grandma hadn't left these out of carelessness. She left them where she knew only one person would think to look. On my way back to town, I stopped at Mr. Rudd's office. He hadn't expected me, but the moment he saw the folder, he ushered me inside. I laid everything out on his desk. He examined each page slowly, meticulously. When he reached the traced signature, he removed his glasses and exhaled. "This," he said quietly, "is fraud. And not recent. Fraud." The word felt both heavy and clarifying. I asked him if these documents were enough to prove what had happened. He nodded. Enough to raise serious questions. And enough to require an audit of every account your grandmother held while Charles acted on her behalf. A cold ripple slid through me. Every account. Every transaction. Every trust. This wasn't about a cabin. It wasn't even about land. It was about everything she had worked her entire life to build. And now, the responsibility to uncover the full extent of the betrayal fell to me. Mr. Rudd leaned forward. "Marian, you need to be very careful. If Charles went to this length to hide what he did, he won't take your involvement lightly." I nodded. I already knew that. Because when I turned on my phone in the parking lot, there were 5 new messages waiting. All from Charles. The last one read, "If you've seen the cabin, we need to resolve this privately. Do not involve the lawyer." But it was too late. The investigation had already begun. And the truth was moving faster than he could stop it. I sat in my parked car outside the lawyer's office, the hum of traffic surrounding me like a distant storm. The folder and photos I'd taken lay on the passenger seat, a quiet weight that represented the choice I now had to make. For most of my life, I'd chosen peace over confrontation. I'd chosen to preserve relationships, even when those relationships cost me pieces of myself. But this wasn't about me anymore. This was about the woman who had loved me without condition. This was about the truth she died trying to protect. As I drove home, I considered my options. Legal, emotional, ethical. Revenge wasn't my nature, but justice was. And justice in its purest form is simply truth brought into the light. I made 3 decisions before reaching my driveway. First, I would not respond to Charles. Second, I would secure everything I had found in multiple copies. Third, I would confront the truth calmly, methodically, without letting anger decide my moves. Inside my house, I began building the foundation of my case. I printed the photos. I backed them up. I wrote a detailed timeline of everything Grandma had told me in her last year. The fleeting comments, the worries she never fully voiced. As I worked, I felt her presence like a steady hand on my shoulder, guiding me forward. By afternoon, I was ready for the next step. I called Charles. He answered on the first ring. His voice was strained, falsely controlled. "Marian, I was hoping you'd come to your senses. I saw the cabin," I said. "And I saw what you left in it." A pause. Then a quiet, tense exhale. "You don't understand what happened," he said. "Mom, she made decisions you weren't aware of. She wasn't as lucid as you thought." There it was. The angle he had chosen. Undermine her memory to protect his actions. "She was lucid enough to hide the evidence," I replied. He didn't speak. "There are documents, Charles. And they're already with the attorney." A sharp inhale. "You shouldn't have done that." Maybe he intended it as a warning. Maybe as a threat. But I didn't let it shake me. "I'm not interested in fighting with you," I said. "I'm interested in correcting what you did. Quietly, if possible. But not silently." The line went cold. Then he said something chilling, something he likely didn't mean to say aloud. "I didn't think she'd leave anything behind. Not I didn't do it. Not you're mistaken. Just that." The quiet confession of a man who believed he had erased the evidence. "I'm giving you a chance," I said gently. A chance to set this right before the legal process uncovers everything. Silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he had hung up. Then, what do you want? Restitution, I said. Transfer the cabin back. Submit the corrected documents. And disclose every account you handled. His breath hitched. That's impossible. It's inevitable. When I ended the call, my hands trembled. Not from fear, but from resolve. The turning point wasn't the evidence. It wasn't the cabin. It was my voice. Steady. Unafraid. For the first time in years, I chose myself, and the truth, over the fragile comfort of keeping peace with someone who had never valued it. The quiet fight had begun. And I knew he would make his next move soon. I didn't have to wait long to see the consequences begin to unfold. 2 days after our call, I received a message from Mr. Rudd asking me to come to his office immediately. His tone was composed, but I sensed urgency beneath it. When I arrived, he ushered me inside and closed the door behind us. There's been movement, he said, handing me a stack of printed emails. They were from a financial examiner, one Charles had tried to contact. And the content was damning. Charles had attempted to clarify several old transactions, claiming they were authorized by Grandma while she was in cognitive decline. The examiner had pushed back, requesting medical records to substantiate the claim. Charles had provided none. Then came the final email, the examiner informing Mr. Rudd that an official review of Grandma's accounts was being initiated. The wheels of justice had begun turning, quietly and without delay. But the more revealing consequences unfolded on the family level. That evening, Lorraine appeared at my door again, this time without Darren. Her posture was stiff, defensive, but there was something else beneath it. Fear. "Marian, what did you do?" she asked. I invited her in. She hesitated at the threshold, but eventually crossed it. Once seated, she exhaled shakily. "Charles called me," she said. "He said you're trying to drag the family through some kind of audit." He said. I raised a hand gently. He lied to Grandma. 4 years. And he stole from her. This isn't speculation, Lorraine. I've seen the documents. Her expression faltered. He told me she gave him permission. Did she ever tell you that? She swallowed hard. No. As our conversation deepened, I began to see cracks in the version of events she'd been fed. She admitted that Grandma had once confronted her about a missing account balance, and Lorraine had brushed it off because Charles told her he was managing things. She had believed him, trusted him, even defended him. Her voice broke a little when she said, "I didn't know." I believed her. For the first time in a long time, I saw the sister I used to know, flawed, complicated, vulnerable, but not malicious. 2 days later, the silent downfall accelerated. Charles's financial accounts were frozen pending review. His employer, a firm with strict ethical standards, placed him on temporary leave. And then, quietly, without ceremony or confrontation, the property deed for the cabin was transferred back into Grandma's estate. No apology. No explanation. Just a legal correction filed under his name. A man who had spent his life manipulating numbers was now being undone by them. But the most striking moment came when Charles called me. His voice, once sharp and confident, had softened into something subdued, almost defeated. "I didn't think anyone would find out," he said. "I didn't think she'd care that much about the cabin." "She didn't care about the cabin," I replied. "She cared about integrity." He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply said, "I'm sorry." Not enough to erase what he'd done, but enough to acknowledge his downfall had begun from the inside. And I didn't need to punish him. The truth was doing its work. When the investigation concluded weeks later, the results were clear and quietly devastating. Charles had diverted funds from 2 of Grandma's accounts. Moderate amounts, nothing extravagant, but enough to feel like a violation. Enough to prove intent. Enough to reveal a pattern. The audit required restitution, which he paid, though with visible strain. His reputation at work was wounded. His relationships within the family were deeply shaken. And though the legal consequences were mild, probationary oversight, mandatory repayment, removal from any executorial role, the emotional consequences endured. For me, the aftermath unfolded more slowly. I returned to the cabin 3 times over the next month, each time stepping into the quiet spaces Grandma once loved. I cleaned the dust from the windows, fixed a broken cabinet hinge, and replaced the curtains with ones she would have chosen, simple cotton with faded blue stripes. In those visits, I realized I wasn't just protecting her legacy. I was healing something inside myself. For so many years, I had believed I needed to stay small to keep the peace. I thought strength meant endurance, silence, compliance. I thought confronting the truth made me difficult. But Grandma had seen me differently. She had known I could be steady in the storm. She had trusted me with this final act of honesty. Lorraine visited me one afternoon, standing awkwardly beside the cabin's porch. Her expression held a mix of guilt and relief. "I should have listened to her," she said quietly. "We all should have," I replied. "I'm sorry for how I treated you," she added, eyes lowered. I believed her. More importantly, I forgave her, because forgiveness wasn't a gift for her. It was a release for me. We talked for an hour. Not about the money. Not about Charles. But about Grandma, her stubbornness, her sharp humor, the way she used to hum tunelessly while cooking. It was the first real conversation we'd had in years. As weeks turned into a new season, the heaviness began to lift. One morning, sitting alone on the cabin steps, I felt a profound sense of peace settle over me. The trees rustled softly, their branches shifting in a language only age understands. I whispered, "I did what you asked." And in that quiet moment, I felt her presence, warm, approving, steady. There was no triumph in exposing the truth. Just clarity. Just dignity. Just the restoration of what should never have been taken. And with that, the weight I had carried since the day of the will began to fade. But the story wasn't finished. Not until I understood what Grandma had really entrusted to me. Not property, not documents, but something far more enduring. In the months that followed, I visited the cabin often, not out of duty, but out of gratitude. It stood like a testament to endurance, to quiet strength, to the kind of legacy that can't be stolen. I realized then that Grandma hadn't chosen me because I was the most compliant or the most convenient. She chose me because I listened, because I questioned, because I didn't look away when something felt wrong, no matter how deeply the family preferred silence. Her final act wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about truth. And truth, I have learned, is the most ethical form of revenge there is. Because it doesn't require cruelty or spectacle. It simply requires courage. As I packed away the letter and key into a small wooden box, my own quiet version of a time capsule, I felt the moral settle into my bones. We spend so much of our lives trying to keep peace by staying silent. But silence is not peace. Silence is permission. And trust, real trust, is not given to the ones who make the fewest waves. It's given to the ones who are willing to face the tide. In the end, Grandma didn't leave me the cabin. She left me a task. She left me clarity. She left me the chance to lift the truth into daylight, gently but firmly, without rage or theatrics. And through that, she returned something to me I hadn't realized I'd lost. My voice. My steadiness. My right to confront what is wrong without apologizing for the space I take in doing so. Before I locked the cabin for the final time that season, I whispered into the stillness, "Thank you for trusting me." The forest answered in a soft wind, brushing through the branches like a final blessing. As I walked back to my car, I felt lighter, not because the conflict was gone, but because I had carried it without losing myself. And if there is a moral to this story, it is this. When someone trusts you most, it is rarely because you are perfect. It is because you are willing to stand in truth, even when others would rather look away. Justice does not always roar. Sometimes it unfolds quietly, in documents and conversations and patient persistence. Sometimes the most powerful confrontation is calm. And sometimes, the greatest inheritance a person can leave you is the courage to do what they could not. That was Grandma's final gift. And I accepted it, not with anger, but with clarity. Not with vengeance, but with integrity. A legacy not of property, but of truth. And that, in the end, is the only legacy that lasts.